The sharp voice of Leila al-Fad cut through the oud-scented air of the majlis like the nick of a keen blade. Noor al-Salim, 29, froze where she stood, half hidden behind one of the palace's towering silk curtains whose tassels brushed the inlaid marble floor like soft waves. The curtain split the grand hall of Al-Zahra Palace into a shimmer of golds and cool blues. Gilded arches fanned outward, carving the ceiling into honeycombed geometry. A chandelier the size of a small garden rained prisms of light upon polished stone. Shadowed alcoves held brass lanterns glowing with amber glass. Everything gleamed, everything watched. Noor's plain Navy service uniform made her look like a misplaced line in an illuminated manuscript. Around her, the Gulf's elite rippled in embroidered kaftans and immaculate bishts. Pearls and rubies pooled at wrists and throats. White gutras were folded with military neatness and anchored with black agals. Waiters drifted by in silent ballet. Silver trays afloat with cardamom coffee in slender finjans, dates stuffed with pistachios and sugared rose petal sweets, returning light like tiny moons. Outside, beyond the carved mashrabia screens, fountains whispered in the courtyard among date palms and star-heavy sky. Inside, the music of a small ensemble, oud, qanun, and a frame drum, brushed the air with restrained elegance. "Guards," Leila declared, lifting her chin as though tasting power on her tongue. Conversation snapped shut across the hall. Fans stilled. A dozen necks turned at once, curiosity doing its old work. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight. It had texture, the way desert air can turn to glass before a storm. Noor stepped out from behind the curtain because there is sometimes only one direction to move when a room is not made for you. Forward. A heat climbed her cheeks. Her eyes did their old accounting. Floor, exit, distance to the nearest door, the polished edge of a marble step where a foot might catch. She drew a breath that smelled of sandalwood and citrus, and the faint metallic scent of polished brass. "I work here," she said, steadying her voice on the railing of truth. "How convenient," Leila answered, and her laugh carried the bright ring of cut crystal. She wore diamonds at her sleeves, and a satisfaction that shone harder than gemstones. People like Leila learned early that humiliation is a kind of currency. They spend it generously in rooms that will reward them for it. Pinned to the left side of Noor's uniform was an antique pearl pendant, a small circle set in filigree silver, its luster soft as the inside of a seashell. It was not the largest thing in the room, it was the truest. Her grandmother had pressed it into Noor's palm years ago with a whisper, "Keep your light close." Noor's fingers found the pendant now, cupping it with the old instinct, like a prayer one says without words. A path opened through the murmuring crowd, the way heat opens a mirage. Sheikha Mariam al-Rashid approached with unhurried certainty. 65, wrapped in black silk stitched with gold. She moved as if every step had been rehearsed by generations. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it merely arrives and expects to be recognized. Sheikha Mariam's eyes, black and exacting, passed over Noor like a ledger balancing itself. "This is inappropriate," she announced, voice cool as shade. She did not look at Leila when she said it, nor at the guards. She looked only at the room, and the room obeyed. Noor straightened a fraction. Dignity can be the last thing you own. She tasted an old memory, the smell of jasmine on a balcony, her grandmother's hands on her shoulders, a small voice telling her the first great secret of surviving polite cruelty. "Stand and let the wind find you." Noor's mouth felt dry. "I'm sure you do," Leila replied, the corners of her lips sharpening into something almost kind and therefore more dangerous. Noor took a step back. Her heel brushed the thick border of the Persian carpet. The smallest wrong thing can become catastrophe when an entire hall wants to see it. Her ankle rolled. The world tilted. She caught nothing. The air itself did not hold her, and she fell to one knee, then to both, the marble as unforgiving as the hush that fell. Her pendant slipped, a small flash of light skipping once, twice, and then rolling in lazy circles as if it were considering which path to take. Time pulled thin. Someone's breath snagged. A flute note faltered and died. At the far end of the hall, a man had been standing very still, the way men stand when they are expected to be landmarks. Quiet, striking, reliable. Prince Khalid bin Zayed, 32, wore an immaculate white thobe beneath a black bisht edged in fine gold. The garment fit him as custom, and caution fit his life. Son of the Emir, heir to a sprawling enterprise that braided ports, hospitals, and sky-high towers under one family crest, Khalid knew how to carry the weight of notice without buckling. Yet what gripped him now was not attention. It was recognition without memory. It was the ache you feel when a word sits at the edge of your tongue and refuses to be born. He saw the pendant spin a last silver circle and come to rest under a rain of chandelier light. Something old and tender moved under his ribs, the way a falcon shifts before flight. He walked. The crowd parted not because he demanded it, but because people learned quickly when to perform obedience. Sheikha Mariam watched her son approach, an approving curve ghosting her mouth. Surely he would handle this, quietly, efficiently, as he handled meetings and ceremonies and the 1,000 small negotiations of being necessary. He did not pass Noor. He stopped in the small clearing of silence that had formed around her. He lowered himself, careful, unhurried, as if kneeling to the past, and picked up the pendant. It was warm, and the warmth surprised him, not because it should not have been warm, but because he had not expected the object to feel so alive, as if it had been waiting for his hand. He turned the piece over once. The pearl was modest, yes, but its glow was stubborn, patient. He looked at Noor and found a steadiness there that met his own without apology. "This is yours," he said, and when he held it out, he did not dangle it between them like a favor. He returned it as one might return a name. She hesitated. The world had not been frequently kind to women in uniforms standing alone in rooms like this, but the sincerity in his eyes was the sort that doesn't arrive by accident, and trust, like fear, can be contagious for a heartbeat. Noor reached, and their fingers touched. The jolt was not lightning. It was recognition, the quiet kind that moves through bone. A current ran the length of Khalid's arm, not painful, but precise. It was as if a door opened somewhere he had forgotten existed. Noor felt it too, and nearly drew back, then did not. She took the pendant, and the breath she had been denying herself. He asked, his voice lower now. The public edge filed away. The word landed between them with the simplicity of light. It meant light. He tasted the meaning before the memory. Desert nights and silver water, a terrace wind, laughter not far away. Something in him shifted to face it. "Khalid," Sheikha Mariam said, with the careful politeness a mother uses in full view of her kingdom. There was nothing rude about the reminder, and yet it cut the moment neatly in half. Khalid did not answer her. He extended his hand to Noor, not in display, not in command, but as someone offering a railing in a storm. "I can manage," Noor said, an old habit rising. Independence had been her armor. She had learned early that help often arrived attached to chains. She pushed herself up, and the world wobbled again. His hand found her forearm, steadying, not gripping. The warmth of him traveled through the thin sleeve of her uniform like a promise that made no demands. "I must go," she whispered, eyes skimming toward the nearest exit. A calculation and a prayer traveling the same road. The question came out softer than he intended, nudged by the sensation that this moment was sliding toward a door he might never open again. The word daughter rearranged the geometry of the hall. Khalid's fingers eased, his brows gathered. His voice was careful now, respectful of the ground he was stepping on. Noor hesitated the way you hesitate, before saying a truth that belongs to more than one person. The name struck him like warm wind at dusk, familiar, carrying the scent of something he could not name. In his mind, a half-remembered conversation turned over in sleep. If it is a girl, Leila, like the night that holds the moon. He blinked, and the room returned, press of perfume and eyes and expectation. He did not understand the pull in his chest, not yet. He only understood urgency. Some choices do not ask permission from the parts of you that prefer caution. He breathed once, long enough to feel the limits of his own restraint. No one in the hall moved. The musicians looked at one another as if the notes on their music stands had been replaced with fireworks. Leila's lips parted. A perfect "oh" she would later deny. Someone's finjan paused halfway to a mouth. A man at the edge of the room coughed, and then decided he had not. 200 people watched reality test its own boundaries. Noor stared at his extended hand, as if it were a gilded snare. The rules here were not written, but they were enforced. Public touch, public attention. These were currencies that could cost her months of carefully guarded anonymity. "I can't," she said. The words a small wall she could still climb back over. He did not say for me. He did not need to. The plea ran along a wire of urgency he could not disguise. It was in his eyes, the particular kind of vulnerability that appears when someone recognizes a door they fear will close. Noor felt the room tilt again, but this time it was not the carpet. It was the old axis of her life, arguing with a new gravity. She thought of Leila asleep under a window that faced a sliver of crescent moon. She thought of rent due, of shifts traded, of hands that smelled of lemon cleanser. She thought of her grandmother, whose stories of the sea always ended with a woman walking straight into the waves and coming back with what the water could not hide. Slowly, she nodded. She placed her fingers in his. The room exhaled, though no one admitted it. The ensemble hesitated, then found a soft waltz. Classical phrasing brushed with maqam color. The oud's voice human and intimate. The first notes threaded between jeweled wrists and polished cufflinks. And Noor stepped forward because the body remembers what the mind claims to have forgotten. Grace is not costume. It is a muscle that waits. Noor's steps were measured, then confident. The smooth slide of a woman who had once counted music in her bones. The line of her neck lengthened, shoulders settling down and back, core firm. The small lift before a turn revealed training that time had not erased. Her uniform, plain as it was, could not muffle the way she occupied space. Purposeful, precise, unafraid for the length of a measure. Khalid matched her without thinking. Protocol teaches one kind of poise. Longing teaches another. He did not force the lead. He invited it, guiding with the suggestion of a hand, the alignment of shoulders, the angle of his palm at her shoulder blade. Never more pressure than the conversation required. Their steps found each other, and then found something larger than steps. Timing like breath shared in low light. Around them, shock reassembled itself into narratives. A noblewoman gathered her shawl and stalked toward the door, her bracelets clashing like tiny swords. A server halted with a tray of saffron custards poised above danger. Whispers unfurled in ribbons, tangled quickly with the upward tilt of phones capturing defiance at 24 frames per second. Somewhere in the corner, a young poet watched with a face full of understanding he would later misname fate. "You used to dance," Khalid said. And it was not a question, because some truths are visible as handprints on glass. "A long time ago," Noor replied, allowing the turn to carry her across a sweep of light. The chandeliers broke against her cheekbones. Her eyes softened with the memory of rehearsal studios and the smell of resin, the ache of bare feet after hours on unforgiving floors. She had left that life because life had not asked politely. It had demanded. Yet the body keeps faith with what it loves. He studied her as one studies familiar calligraphy in a stranger's hand, the tilt of her head at the end of a phrase, the cautious half-smile that arrived only when the movement did, the way she counted a breath before risk. Something in him felt less alone near it. At the edge of the dance floor, Sheikha Mariam watched with a face that betrayed nothing and everything. To the untrained eye, she was simply composed, but a tiny stillness along her jaw, there, revealed calculation adjusting to new data. Her son was making a scene. The scene would be discussed. The discussion would invite leverage. Power, like water, prefers predictable channels. The sight of it spilling across polished marble unsettled her. Leila stood beside the sheikha with a smile sheathed like a dagger. "How unusual," she murmured, as if applauding an exotic animal for doing something nearly human. "Unnecessary," Sheikha Mariam corrected, the word smooth as satin. She did not glance at Leila. She did not look away from the dance. Noor felt the pressure of 100 glances and released it by returning to the work of the next step, then the next. There is a freedom in focusing on the count. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She felt the give of Khalid's palm at her back, the near invisible suggestion of a left turn, the shared center they found as if they had been mapping toward it for years. The music deepened and unwound. The oud answered itself. The drum stitched the answer to time. The name tasted right in his mouth. It meant light. He could feel the truth of it in the way she brightened the space around her without adornment. "Prince Khalid," she whispered, formality and gratitude in equal parts. Etiquette here was not trivial. It was architecture. She honored the architecture even as she made a doorway in it. "Just Khalid," he said. And in those two words there was a small fracture opening in the wall he had been taught to maintain. She risked the corner of a smile, And in that thin light he saw a life. A small apartment, washed in the smell of lemon and laundry, a girl's laughter, a window large enough for a slice of sky. He did not know how he knew, he only knew he wanted to. On the mezzanine, a pair of journalists from a fashion magazine debated whether to post the footage they were collecting. One argued that it would break in minutes anyway. The other calculated the angles of favor and fallout and decided to crop the frame so that only hands and silhouettes could be seen. Below, an old man, who had fought too many boardroom battles to be impressed by anything, found himself unexpectedly moved. The melody swelled once, then softened like a breath after laughter. Noor's pendant warmed against her skin as it swung, a small moon following a private tide. She touched it once, briefly, mid-turn, a reflexive reassurance. Khalid noticed. "It suits you," he said. "It belonged to my grandmother," she answered. He almost asked, "What does it remember?" But the question felt too intimate for a room that had not earned it. Instead, he guided her through a turn that set the chandelier light on fire in her eyes. The waltz curled toward a cadence. For a moment, just there between the penultimate chord and the last, the entire hall seemed to lean closer, as if ready to be persuaded. Noor felt it, a collective inhale held on the edge of possibility. She allowed herself, for the first time in years, to step fully into the space that opened in front of her without deciding first whether she deserved it. When the music resolved, it did not so much stop as settle, like the end of a prayer. Noor and Khalid came to stillness almost at the same time, the echo of motion still humming in their bones. They were not holding each other. They were holding the air they had shared. Applause did not come. The room had not decided what story this was. The phones had. The phones were certain it was the kind of story that would be watched beneath blankets late at night or in office bathrooms between meetings. The prince and the woman who was not supposed to be chosen, turning a forbidden room into a place where bodies are allowed to tell the truth. Noor stepped back first. A fraction. Protocol returned like a tide. She lowered her gaze, though not in surrender, more like a warrior sheathing a blade after surviving the circle. "Thank you," she said, because gratitude was both accurate and safe. Khalid opened his mouth, closed it, then found a gentler line of approach. It was insufficient and correct. "A long time ago," Noor said again, but this time there was a thread of something tender running through the words. Relief, perhaps, or grief's quieter cousin, recognition. Behind them, Leila's voice restarted the world with a sugar-coated clink. Sheikha Mariam did not reply. Her eyes had shifted, marker sharp, to Noor's pendant, and back to Noor's face, making a note she would not speak yet. Across the hall, the fountains outside sang on, indifferent, and the lanterns hummed their warm approval of nothing in particular. For Noor, the hall suddenly felt too bright. She thought of Leila, of the way her daughter's sleep tangled her curls into a small crown, of the way she would wake and ask in a voice full of belief, "Mama, did you dance in your dreams?" Noor swallowed. Her throat was tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. For Khalid, the moment cracked open in a line of quiet clarity. He did not yet have the answers that would arrive like storms. He had only the certainty, thin but unbreakable, that something he had lost without noticing had stepped back into his reach. He did not know what to do with that certainty. He knew only not to look away. And for the room, rich with mirrors, bright with careful light, the story had found its opening note. The hook had been set, a prince who never danced with anyone at such events, and a woman who moved as if music remembered her, a matriarch who did not like surprises, a pendant that had held the warmth of another life and given it back. Across the filigreed windows, the crescent moon tilted, watching like an old witness. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, in a neighborhood the drivers would never map for their employers, a small girl turned in her sleep and smiled, as if hearing distant music. For the first time in years, Noor allowed herself to answer a question she had been refusing to ask. What if the door is real? And then, in a room that wanted to decide her story without her, she let herself, just for one clean, treacherous heartbeat, dream. The final chord of the waltz trembled in the air, a fragile thread of sound that seemed reluctant to sever itself from the moment. Noor's breathing was steady, but inside she felt the weight of 200 eyes pressing against her skin, cataloging her presence, her posture, her daring to exist in this space. Khalid's hand still cradled hers, not tightly, but with the kind of deliberate gentleness that made the gesture harder to dismiss as accidental. For a heartbeat, They didn't move. The music had ended, but they remained in that suspended space, two figures still aligned while the rest of the world struggled to remember its cues. The murmurs began as a trickle, a pair of merchants trading disbelief under their breath, a diplomat's wife covering her lips with jeweled fingers to hide a whisper, a journalist angling his phone lower, pretending not to record. The scent of oud still clung to the air, mingling with the sharper sweetness of rosewater, but now it seemed heavier, as if it too had taken notice. Khalid's eyes were dark pools of composure, but Noor could see the undercurrent beneath them. Curiosity, recognition, and something more dangerous, intent. She fought the impulse to step back. To retreat was to concede the narrative to those who had already begun crafting it in their minds. Her grandmother's voice returned like a quiet tide. A woman with courage in her heart never dances alone. "Thank you," she murmured. The words were small, but they steadied her. Khalid's gaze didn't shift. "For asking," she said, and her fingers curled ever so slightly in his, as if acknowledging the gravity of the choice she had just made. The murmurs fractured, replaced by the subtle wave that meant someone of greater power was moving. From the far edge of the hall, Sheikha Mariam al-Rashid advanced. The crowd's awareness shifted with her progress, parting in graceful, almost unconscious alignment. She was draped in a black abaya edged with gold thread so fine it seemed to catch the light in secret, the folds of her silk shayla falling like a calculated shadow. Her expression was perfectly composed, but her eyes carried a ledger's weight, assessing, recording, judging. She stopped 2 steps from them, her gaze sliding briefly to Noor before fixing on her son. "Khalid," she said, her tone cool and precise, the way a master calligrapher might make the first stroke of an unbreakable contract. He didn't release Noor's hand. The pause between her inhale and her next word was deliberate, a space heavy enough to silence the remaining whispers. The single syllable was wrapped in velvet but carried the weight of tradition, obligation, and the unspoken reality that in this palace, requests from Sheikha Mariam were rarely requests at all. Noor felt the tension in Khalid's hand, not resistance, but an unwillingness to sever the connection too quickly. He leaned slightly toward her. "Stay," he said softly, a question hidden as a suggestion. Noor met his gaze for the briefest second. Everything about this room told her to disappear, yet some part of her refused to step backward into the anonymity it offered. She gave the smallest nod, but when he finally released her hand, the absence of his touch felt more noticeable than its presence. The guests resumed their low conversations as Khalid followed his mother toward a cluster of foreign dignitaries. Noor, aware that remaining in the center of the hall would be like holding a torch in a room full of oil lamps, began making her way toward the side exit reserved for staff. Each step felt like moving through a current of eyes, faces she didn't know but whose expressions she would remember. The raised eyebrow of an older merchant, the pitying half-smile of a woman in emerald silk, the calculating glance of a man she suspected was already turning her into a cautionary anecdote. The air shifted as she stepped beyond the main archway into the service corridor. Here, the marble floors gave way to polished stone, the gold accents fading into the practical simplicity of daily palace life. The sounds of the banquet were muted, replaced by the quiet efficiency of staff moving with practiced discretion. She had taken no more than 10 steps when a young attendant in a crisp white thobe appeared from an adjoining passage. He bowed his head respectfully. "Miss Noor," he said in a tone that was soft but carried an edge of formality. Her first instinct was refusal, but the thought was fleeting. The request was not truly a request. She nodded, following him down a narrow corridor lined with carved wooden doors. The air here was cooler, scented faintly with jasmine drifting in from an open courtyard. The room they entered was smaller than the grand hall, but no less deliberate in its opulence. Cushioned seats hugged the walls beneath a series of arched windows, each fitted with delicate mashrabia screens that filtered the moonlight into patterned shadows across the floor. On a low table sat a silver tray of untouched dates, their sugar-dusted surfaces glistening like captured stars, alongside a dalla of cardamom coffee whose steam curled upward in lazy, deliberate spirals. Mariam stood near one of the windows, her back to the lattice work, the soft glow outlining the silhouette of a woman who had never been required to raise her voice to command a room. "You dance well," she said without turning. "Thank you, Sheikha," Noor replied, her voice careful, neutral. Mariam faced her then, her gaze sweeping over Noor in a single pass. It was not the gaze of a stranger seeing someone for the first time. It was the gaze of a strategist evaluating an unexpected variable. It has been many years since I have seen my son choose his own partner in public. Noor's spine straightened. He asked. The shaker's lips curved, but it was not amusement. A pause stretched between them. Noor kept her eyes steady, though she felt the instinctive urge to shield herself, as if Mariam's gaze could pull apart the seams of her composure. "You have a daughter," Mariam said. The words unadorned, yet weighted. Noor's fingers tightened involuntarily around the edge of her abaya. "Children are delicate. They require stability, protection." Mariam's tone remained even, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Noor understood the meaning clearly. "I know where your heart is most vulnerable, and I can reach it." She drew a slow breath. "My daughter is my life," she said. Mariam's gaze held hers for a beat longer, then softened by the smallest degree, a gesture that could have been mistaken for kindness, if not for the precision of its timing. Without another word, she turned back toward the window, dismissing Noor with the elegance of someone accustomed to controlling when a conversation ended. Outside, the courtyard was bathed in moonlight, the fountain whispering in a language older than the palace itself. Noor stepped into the cooler air, her pulse still quickened, the pendant at her throat warm against her skin. She touched it instinctively, as if to anchor herself to something older, something untouched by the power plays of the present. Back in the grand hall, Khalid stood beside the crown prince, listening to a discussion on trade agreements, his posture perfect, his expression attentive. But his mind was elsewhere, on the exact shade of Noor's eyes under the chandeliers, on the sound of her voice saying "Insha'Allah," on the way his mother's arrival had felt less like an interruption and more like the opening move of a game he had not yet learned the rules to. When the crown prince's attention shifted, Khalid allowed his gaze to drift toward the far archway. Noor was no longer there. The space she had occupied seemed to hum with absence, as if the air itself had been altered and would take time to settle. He wondered if she had left the palace entirely, or if she lingered somewhere within its labyrinth of corridors. He wondered if he would see her again before the night ended. And, against every instinct drilled into him since boyhood, he wondered what it might cost him if he didn't. The gates of Al-Zahra Palace closed behind Noor with a solemn thud that seemed to fold the night back over itself. Inside those walls, everything had gleamed: cut crystal, hammered gold, carved cedar, silk breathing perfume into the air. Out here, the city exhaled differently, cooler, grainier, laced with sea salt and a dry whisper of sand moving somewhere beyond the last line of streetlights. Noor crossed the service court with her bag hugged to her side, the pearl pendant warm under her collarbone as if it had trapped the last notes of the waltz and refused to let them go. The staff van idled beneath a crooked lamp. Its paint had long ago surrendered to the sun. Its windows held a fine veil of dust that never quite left, no matter how often it was wiped. The driver, a man whose fingers still rolled prayer beads out of habit, met Noor's eyes in the mirror and gave a small nod that meant more than talk. She slid into the back, let her head rest against the cool glass, and watched the palace recede as they pulled out. Domes like sleeping moons, arches lit from within as if the building itself were a lantern, the tall palms in the forecourt lifting their fronds in a wind that moved more gently than her thoughts. The road carried them through the city's layers. First, the ceremonial avenues where fountains kept perfect time, and the night gardeners trimmed hedges into obedience. Then, the commercial spine, loud with neon and kitchen smoke, where bakers drew trays of sesame bread from ovens and boys in aprons balanced pyramids of pistachio pastries in the windows. A little farther, and the towers gave way to low buildings the color of sand and shade. Clotheslines made their own geometry against the stars. Balconies held potted basil and plastic chairs. The air, here, belonged to people who ate on their own schedules and kept their doors ajar for neighbors. Noor stepped from the van into the soft grit of her street. The stairwell bulb hummed with a tired light. She climbed, palm brushing the railing whose paint had blistered into little C's. On the second landing, a cat blinked at her with the offended dignity of a landlord. On the third, someone's radio let a singer's voice drift into the night, a thick caramel sound that made even bad news bearable. At her door, Noor paused and listened. Behind the wood, a small voice, not so much singing as remembering a melody, rose and fell. She smiled before the lock even turned. Leila sat cross-legged on the narrow bed. The stuffed camel clutched like a secret against her chest. Her hair, dark, unruly, exactly as it pleased, had worked free of its ribbon. The lamp on the crate that served as a nightstand painted her cheeks with a warm halo. She looked up and smiled with her whole face, and Noor felt the world do the one kindness it never charged for. It let the worst of the evening slide off her shoulders for the length of a heartbeat. They found each other in the middle of the small room. Leila smelled of soap and the day's sun and the faintest sugar of a cookie she'd been promised for finishing her homework. Noor kissed her hair and her forehead, and the place between her brows where worries collect in older people, and then looked over Leila's shoulder toward the kitchenette. Aunt Hannah, widow, watcher, repository of everyone's missing buttons and children, was rinsing 2 cups as if a sink were a shoreline and patience a tide. She was good, Hannah said, voice low so as not to break the spell. Like any good lawyer, Noor said. I learned from the best, Leila chimed, and Hannah snorted, pleased, before collecting her shawl. Sleep now, Moon, she said to Leila, and to Noor in the same breath. If you need me, call. When the door clicked shut, the apartment felt larger, the way rooms do when they have only one heartbeat to keep. Aunt Hannah told me a story, Leila announced, rearranging the camel so that its one-button eye faced bravely forward. A princess in a tower who was tired of looking at the same square of sky. She wanted the whole sky, so she climbed down, and everyone said it wasn't allowed, but she did it anyway. Leila considered. Her seriousness always surprised Noor. It was like watching a small bird make an adult choice. She thought the sea would make her feel big. That's a good feeling, Noor said. It's not the end, Leila added, as if endings were for people with fewer ideas. Noor tucked a curl behind Leila's ear. The question arrived the way children's questions often do, with a casual knife of perception hidden in it. For a moment, Noor stood again under a chandelier, the floor turning the way the sea turns under a moon. She swallowed the truth that had nothing to do with sleep. Maybe a little, she said. Leila's eyes were not teasing. They were measuring. Noor felt the thread pull tight. It was with music, Noor said carefully. Leila accepted this because she wanted to, and because she knew enough already to accept the difference between the answers adults give and the answers they wish they could. Noor read to her from a picture book about a date palm and a stubborn wind. Halfway through, Leila's lashes slowed their blinking, and the stuffed camel's ear ended up in her fist. The apartment settled into the kindness of little sounds, the kettle ticking as it cooled, the neighbor upstairs moving 1 chair rather than 2, a scooter passing below like a quick pencil line drawn across the night. Noor sat by the window, which was nothing like a palace window and therefore much easier to love. Streetlight laid a coin of brightness on the sill. Beyond the narrow street, the sky arranged its quiet. She touched the pendant, the pearl smooth as a thought you cannot ignore. It had warmed under Khalid's hand earlier. The memory of that transfer of heat lived at the base of her throat now, oddly comforting and deeply inconvenient. She heard Sheikha Mariam's voice again, polite, polished, edged like script cut into stone. Keep her there. The words had sounded like care. They had meant a boundary and the promise of a consequence. Noor closed her fingers around the pendant until her knuckles paled, then relaxed them and breathed out through her nose the way dancers do when counting without numbers. Protect Leila. Work tomorrow. Keep the rhythms that keep a life. And yet, underneath the good sense of all those instructions, another rhythm persisted. The music still inside her feet, the alignment of 2 bodies finding a center they had no right to find in that room. She hated that it felt like hope. She distrusted hope the way sailors distrust calm seas. Her phone vibrated gently against the book on the sill. A message from Hannah. She dreamt of a man with gentle eyes. Don't be afraid if she asks. Noor stared until the words doubled. She typed, "Thank you." Hannah sent back a blue heart and a falcon. The old symbols were never far. Across the city, the palace slept the complicated sleep of institutions, never fully. In Khalid's chambers, the lamps had been turned down to thinking light. He had changed into a plain thobe, its cotton cool against skin that felt like it had stood too close to a fire. On the table lay a set of documents in 2 languages and 3 types of obligation. He read the first sentence of one, the last sentence of another, and understood all the words without finding the meaning. He set them aside and poured coffee from a dala that had been warmed to precisely the degree he preferred. The cardamom lifted, green and clean. He didn't drink it. He stepped out onto his balcony. The garden below made a black lace out of its hedges. The fountain's voices found each other and braided into one line. The city lights beyond looked like ships refusing to dock. Khalid thought of a time he had not thought of for years. A boyhood afternoon on a terrace where his father had told him that love was like wind. It filled sails and toppled tents. Useful, dangerous. The trick was to learn the direction and never pretend it wasn't there. He could still feel where Noor's hand had rested in his. Not the pressure, the permission. He had asked, and she had said yes, and that yes had reconfigured a portion of the earth he walked on. His mother's eyes had done what they always did, measured risk as if it were a currency that only she understood. He had never been reckless. He was not reckless now. He was simply unwilling to lie to himself about what had happened between the first note and the last. In some rooms, truth is the most disruptive guest. He should not think of Leila. It was not his right, and yet the name would not leave him. Leila. He let it sit on his tongue without saying it, the way you test a word you already know for a second meaning. He could imagine the child's bed, the stuffed animal. Of course, there would be one. Every child who deserved kindness had at least one. The window. He did not try to imagine Noor's husband because the absence of any mention had already done that arithmetic for him. His mother kept a book in which she wrote no names and kept all the numbers. If Mariam knew the child's name, she knew the address, the school, the days of the week that were easiest to break. He gripped the balcony's cool stone until his pulse steadied. He had made many mistakes in his life. He did not intend to make this one, believing that distance equaled safety for anyone but himself. Back in the apartment, Noor watered the two plants that persisted in the thin soil of their terracotta pots and tilted them a little toward the window so they could see more moon than wall. She cleaned the cups without running the tap too loudly, wrote a short note for the morning to remind herself to pick up laundry soap and to ask the manager at the agency about extra hours, then folded the paper and slid it under the magnet shaped like a pomegranate on the fridge. The ordinary saved her from collapse more dependably than prayer. Still, she whispered a small one. Half thanks, half stubbornness. Her phone hummed again. An unknown number. She didn't move at first. The screen lit the room in a thin square of white. When it stopped, a voice message icon blinked. She pressed play with her thumb, already preparing to delete a wrong number. A child's giggle filled the room, then a second's silence, then the soft scrape of the phone against fabric. A low voice came on, the kind of voice that belongs to men taught to speak softly so that others will lean in. He didn't say, "Prince, forgive the intrusion. I won't keep it long. I only wanted to say, thank you for trusting me for the length of a song. I will not disturb you again." There was the faintest shake in the last word, as if a line had been pulled tight and then cut. Noor stared at the dark screen until she could breathe without noticing herself do it. She looked at Leila, sleeping the honest sleep of small people who forgive faster than they learn they shouldn't. She pressed the phone to her chest, then put it face down under the book on the sill as if to muffle her own impatience. She did not reply. She did not delete the message. At the palace, Khalid set his phone down, with a care that suggested it was made of thinner glass than it was. He had asked his assistant for many things over the years, most of them about money, logistics, or mercy handed out in envelopes. He had not asked anyone to find a number tonight. The message had found its way to a phone through a private corridor of connections his position allowed him to access, and his conscience had debated with more heat than usual. He told himself he had chosen restraint. He did not ask himself whether restraint meant anything once the first step had been taken. A breeze lifted and moved through Noor's curtains, touching the corners of the room that light never reached. On the table, the picture book lay open to the page where the princess and the camel faced the sea. Noor traced the coastline with her finger without noticing. Then she turned the page and found nothing printed there, just blank paper, ready. She laughed once, quietly, at herself and at the night for being so on the nose. Leila woke, as children do, not because the world asked her to, but because a dream found its ending. She sat up, hair a cloud, eyes still half at sea. "Mama," she whispered, "I dreamed there was a man who danced with you." Noor felt two things at once, the old fear that truth would find them without an invitation, and the old relief that sometimes it didn't need one to feel right. "Dreams are clever," she said, smoothing Leila's hair back. Leila asked, already drifting again. "Yes," Noor said, and did not add the rest of what she knew. That kindness is not a plan, and plans are what keep people housed and fed. Khalid, sleepless, returned to his table and placed the pen in the exact groove it belonged to. He signed 3 papers with a hand that had not forgotten precision. He made a note in the margin of a 4th. "See revised port figures?" Asked Tariq about the feasibility of splitting the tranche. He looked at the clock and rehearsed lines he would have to say tomorrow to people who would believe him because he had never given them a reason not to. He did not rehearse anything he might say to Noor. He would not see her. He told himself this twice. He believed it once. Both of them, then, did the thing that people do when they are divided by money, distance, and the architecture of their names. They looked up. The crescent hung above the city like a letter from an alphabet older than law. Noor leaned her forehead against the cool glass and let the shape of the moon press a mark into her thoughts. Khalid let the same light draw a clean white line across his knuckles on the balcony rail. The light made no distinction. It did not ask who could afford it. Something, between them, grew a root that would be very hard to dig out later. It did not care what gardens it was allowed in. The morning light came to the city like a gentle promise. A cool veil stretched briefly over streets and courtyards before the sun's true heat reclaimed its dominion. In the neighborhoods far from the palace, shutters opened to the call of merchants arranging baskets of figs and pomegranates. The smell of cardamom coffee drifted from windows, and the sea breeze carried with it the faint tang of salt. But in the high walls of Al Zahra Palace, the day began with a different sort of precision, one born not from the turning of the earth, but from the strict design of human will. Servants moved in coordinated silence through corridors, where sunlight filtered through carved stone lattice, scattering delicate patterns over marble floors. The sound of silver trays settling onto inlaid tables was the morning's only music. In the eastern reception hall, Sheikha Mariam al-Rashid stood at the open arch of the balcony, a tall figure wrapped in a black abaya, shot through with threads of gold so fine they caught the light only when she turned. Her shayla framed a face that seemed to have been carved with the same care as the palace columns, every angle exact, every expression chosen. Below her, the gardens stretched in a pattern of symmetry so precise that from this height they looked like an intricate carpet woven from living green. She did not look at them. She looked past them, toward the pale line of the horizon, where the morning haze softened the meeting of sand and sky. Behind her, 3 members of the royal family council stood in patient silence. 2 men in dark bishts, 1 woman in a pale gold abaya whose color had been chosen, no doubt, to speak of humility while reminding everyone who saw it of the power she possessed. They were not standing because custom demanded it. They were standing because in Mariam's presence, sitting without invitation felt unnatural. "We will not speak of trade today," she said, without turning from the balcony. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a decision already made. Mariam allowed herself the smallest nod. The gold-clad woman tilted her head. "Breach implies an intent to harm, Sheikha." Mariam turned then, the movement slow, deliberate, the kind that made even her stillness an act of power. Coincidence is a word the weak use when they lack the courage to see pattern. Elsewhere in the palace, Khalid walked the long length of the northern corridor, his steps quick but measured, his white thobe shifting softly around him with each stride. The walls here were lined with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch his passing with eyes painted to hold judgment forever. His phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He ignored it. His morning was already crowded. Trade negotiations at 10, an inspection of the new naval docks at noon, a formal dinner with foreign investors in the evening. But the memory of Noor's hand in his from the night before was like a stone dropped into the flow of all those obligations, altering the current in ways he did not yet understand. He entered his father's study without the usual pause at the threshold. The emir sat behind a desk carved from ancient cedar, the surface spread with contracts, maps, and letters bearing seals from half the capitals in the Gulf. His eyes, steady and sharp, met his son's without hostility, but with a depth of appraisal Khalid had only seen matched by one other person, his mother. Where Mariam's gaze measured threats to her personal sphere, the emir's weighed every action as a move in a larger game. "You danced with a servant," the emir said, no greeting preceding the words. Khalid's answer came evenly. "A woman whose life you cannot enter without tearing apart hers," his father replied. Khalid felt the truth in the words, but refused the implication. I speak as though you underestimate consequence, the emir said, leaning back, the sleeves of his bisht falling into elegant folds. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that lets you hear your own pulse. In the modest apartment across the city, Noor was beginning her morning as if the night before had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. She braided Leila's hair at the small kitchen table, placed bread and olives before her, walked her down the street to the school gates where the scent of baking flatbread rose from the shop nearby. But as she returned home, she saw something that slowed her step. A black car parked at the corner, its surface polished to a mirror. Two men in crisp white thobes stood beside it, their posture casual but their attention precise, scanning the street as though committing each face to memory. She knew before they moved who they served. One stepped forward, his shadow falling long in the morning sun. His tone was polite in the way of formality that leaves no space for refusal. Sheikha Mariam requests your presence. The word requests was an ornament on the truth. There was no choice here. The journey back to the palace was a study in contrasts. Her mind caught between the streets she knew and the one she was being driven toward. The hum of the engine was constant, the city sliding past outside in layers of life she could not touch. Market stalls spilling color, children running between doorways, men in shop fronts arguing over the price of saffron. At the palace gate, the guards glanced once at the car and let it pass without a word. The air inside the walls seemed heavier, perfumed, rehearsed. Mariam was waiting in a reception hall whose ceilings arched high above, the walls adorned with mosaics that told stories of hunts and victories. On a small gilded table beside her stood a falcon, its hood still in place, feathers neat as a combed field. She ran her hand once along its back before removing the hood. The bird's eyes opened to the light with the sharp focus of a predator that misses nothing. Noor was led to stand before her. The falcon tilted its head slightly, as though appraising prey. Mariam's gaze dropped to the pearl at Noor's throat. "You wear it again," she said, her voice soft as silk drawn over a blade. "It is mine," Noor replied, steady despite the chill under her skin. She fastened the glove to her wrist and let the falcon step onto her arm. "In my family, when we wish to keep something precious, we train it to return to us." Noor met her eyes. Now Mariam's smile was beautiful, precise, and dangerous. The falcon's talons flexed against the glove. The sound was small, but it carried. Noor was dismissed without further word, her exit marked only by the slow blink of the falcon as she turned away. In the corridor beyond, Khalid appeared, his presence sudden and deliberate. "You called her here," he said to his mother, his voice low but edged. Mariam regarded him with the calm of someone whose control was not in question. She has a child," Khalid said. "I threatened nothing," Mariam replied. Khalid stepped closer, close enough for his shadow to cross hers. She asked, not in challenge, but in genuine curiosity, "Defy your father. Ignore the council." His silence was his answer, and for the first time in many years it was not an agreement. That evening the wind began to lift over the city, gathering in quiet corners, curling around the bases of walls. In her apartment, Noor sat by the window, Leila asleep beside her. The street below was losing its sharpness under a thin veil of sand. She turned the pearl in her palm, feeling the weight of it as both anchor and chain. At the same moment, far away in his chamber, Khalid stood on his balcony, watching the first grains strike the polished stone. The air had shifted, dry and restless, the taste of a storm. Somewhere between them, the city braced itself for weather it could not stop. The sandstorm came in low and steady, first as a taste on the tongue, then as a hiss along the flagstones, then as a veil that thinned the palace lights into pale moons. By sunset, the domes of Al-Zahra seemed to float inside a lantern of dust. The garden's symmetry softened into suggestion, the fountain's whispers swallowed by wind. Inside, the palace chose denial. Chandeliers burned brighter, servants moved faster, and the great banquet began as if weather were a rumor that did not apply to those who knew how to pronounce power. Music threaded the hall with courtly confidence. The scent of saffron and lamb, of rosewater and cardamom, layered the air like polite conversation. Khalid stood at his father's side and did what his lineage demanded. He matched the emir's measured pace, accepted the bows, spoke the right warmth to the right men. He felt the sand press against the glass, as if the storm itself were listening for a crack. Across the crescent of tables,
Maryam watched him the way a falcon watches the edge of a field, still, intent, already calculating flight. When the musicians fell to a quieter passage and the first course was cleared, the emir lifted his hand and the room found its hush.
He spoke of harbors enlarged and trade made safe, of friendship written into contracts, of the family's duty to hold steady when others drift. Then, almost casually, he invited Sheikh Hamad and his daughter to join them for dessert. The councillors' faces relaxed a fraction. Everyone knew what dessert meant. In a neighborhood far from the palace, where wind drove grit into window frames and made laundry lines hum like strings, Noor tucked Leila into bed with a story about a date palm that learned to bend without breaking. The storm scratched at the glass. Leila listened with her eyes as much as her ears. The stuffed camel pulled close under her chin. Noor kissed her temple. Safe is slow. Leila yawned and fell into sleep as if diving into warm water. Noor rinsed 2 cups at the sink and set them upside down to dry, the storm's rustle threading through the silence of the small apartment. She had ignored the envelope for hours. It waited on the table like a folded verdict, heavy with someone else's certainty. She broke the seal. A plane ticket to Doha. A contract with figures that would keep a mother and child more than comfortable. Schooling for Leila. Accommodation in a district of new glass. A position in a housekeeping bureau that called itself Domestic Excellence and felt like a cage with velvet bars. At the bottom, in a hand she recognized from press releases and condolence letters. If you love your child, choose air that is calm. Monsieur Noor's hands went cold and steady at once. The storm pushed against the window, and she understood the temptation of weather that never changes. But she also knew what grows in still air, nothing that breathes. At the palace, the music shifted again, and a procession of sweets appeared with the inevitability of tides. The emir's glance grazed Khalid's shoulder, now, and Mariam's eyes warmed by a degree that meant victory in sight. The young woman at Khalid's right smiled with the poise of training and the kindness of a person who had done nothing wrong except be useful. He answered her present tense questions with future-proof words and felt the space inside his chest begin to harden around something that should not be encased. He excused himself politely to take a call he did not have. The service corridor smelled faintly of oud and stone dust. Screens cut light into lattices on the floor. The storm's voice pressed through the seams of the palace like a crowd outside a door. He stopped in a pool of shadow and did not plan what would happen next. He simply admitted it to himself. If the life he had been given could not hold the truth that had found him, then the life would have to widen. Behind him, soft steps. In front of him, a figure whose outline he knew before the face lifted. Noor. Someone had asked her to deliver a parcel to the palace kitchens, work that could be offered to hands that were supposed to be invisible. She had said yes because that is what people without deniability say to work. You shouldn't be here, he said, because truth and care sometimes begin with the same sentence. I was told there was a shift, she answered, because care without truth is a short road to ruin. A moment balanced, sand ticking against the windows, far music, the smell of rain that never falls in a desert, but sometimes pretends to. They offered you distance, he said. She held his gaze the way a dancer holds balance, with attention and breath. They offered my daughter safety, she said. He swallowed what anger wanted to be and chose usefulness instead. If you go, you will not be lost to me. Then tell me there is another way, Noor whispered, and the storm leaned close to listen. Footsteps, crisp and protocol found them. A steward bowed. Khalid's mouth moved before permission. The steward did not leave. He had not been sent to deliver a choice. He had been sent to collect a son. Khalid let his eyes rest on Noor's face for 1 second longer than safety. She almost smiled. The person who makes me honest, he said, and then he turned and went back toward lights he did not want. The hall received him with applause meant for a speech he had not yet given. The emir stood. The council centered itself. Mariam's hand rested on the back of a chair as if its weight mattered to the room's balance. The emir spoke first, and the words were perfect, so prudent, so generous, so inevitable. He praised Sheikh Hamad's foresight, the daughter's education, the family's alignment, the stability to be gained when 2 houses wrote each other's names into the future. He turned to Khalid. My son, he said, we ask only that you honor what has carried us to this day. Khalid stood. He felt the old training rise like a tide at his back. Say the words, be the bridge. Do not shake, when others must cross. He faced the guests. The storm hissed at the windows like 1,000 whispers trying to become one voice. He looked at Mariam. She did not blink. "I will honor what has carried us to this day," he said, and for a heartbeat the room relaxed. There it was, the shape they knew, the sun fitting the mold. The mold cracked. The hall did not breathe. "I danced last night," he said into the silence, "with a woman who has less money than anyone in this room, and more dignity than some of us could bear. I asked her to trust me for the length of a song." Mariam's smile did not move. Only her eyes changed, the way the edge of a blade changes when sunlight finds it. "You are tired, Khalid," she said, and it was almost gentle. The emir's hand opened over the table. It was not a command. It was a doorway to the old path. Khalid kept his voice even. "Father, I will not marry for a deal. Not tonight." The first murmur ran the curve of the room like a breeze made of knives. Mariam raised 2 fingers and killed it. "Stories are charming," she said, then lighter, to the hall. "Forgive us," she turned to a steward. "But weather sometimes does not pass politely." 2 doors opened at once. The ceremonial double doors, through which a junior minister hurried with a face he had not been taught to fix, and the side door, through which a woman in a modest abaya entered with the angle of someone who has not been invited but cannot be stopped. Noor moved like a shadow that had learned to cast itself. She did not look at Khalid. She went to Mariam and inclined her head, the precise degree that acknowledges rank and refuses ownership. "Forgive the intrusion, Sheikha," she said softly. She held out a small recorder. It should not have mattered. In rooms like this, evidence bends to names. But the junior minister, sweating, pale, pushed a folder toward the emir, toward the council, toward the day that had assumed it would end differently. "We received an anonymous packet," he said, voice thin. "Recordings, financial transfers." The last 2 words were new to this hall. They did not belong to banquets. They belonged to offices with fluorescent lights and waiting chairs that had forgotten how to be comfortable. Mariam's hand did not move from the chair. "Someone has been industrious," she said, and the air cooled a degree. Noor did not look away. "Industrious is one word," she said. She put the recorder on the table and pressed play. The whole listened to a voice it knew, Mariam's, speaking in a smaller room about weather and mistakes, about mothers and children, about paths cleared for those who stood in the way. It was not a confession. It did not need to be. It was a map of pressure. A second clip followed. Another woman. A different year. The same shape of persuasion. The council's gold-clad member kept her face still and wrote nothing on a pad that had suddenly become heavy. Khalid did not move. He watched the truth take its shape in a place built to resist it. The emir's eyes lowered once to the paper, then rose to his wife's face with something like grief's first breath. He said nothing. Mariam's fingers lifted from the chair back the way a falcon lifts from a glove. No panic, only recalculation. Noor's answer was very quiet. The storm pressed its full weight against the glass. The chandeliers trembled and steadied. Someone coughed and remembered where they were. The emir placed one palm flat on the table. "Enough," he said, not to silence, but to war. He looked to the minister. "The ministry will do what the ministry must. The council will convene at morning." He turned to Khalid. For a heartbeat, the father looked at the son without the emir's armor. Then the armor returned. "Go," he said. And the word meant, "Take the person you have brought into my house and remove the match from this room." Khalid did not wait for the floor to find its old shape. He crossed to Noor, and without touching her, matched his pace to hers. The side door swallowed them. The corridor received them with the smell of dust and old cedar. For 3 heartbeats, they did not speak. Then the spell broke. The city poured its voice through a crack in a window, and somewhere a servant dropped a tray, and the sound traveled like a small truth. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I could not do it," she replied. He closed his eyes and opened them on resolve. He took out his phone and called the one person in the palace who had never sold him a clean lie. "Tariq," he said, "bring the car to the west gate. No escorts." He turned back to Noor. "We will not run." The car found them at the service gate where palms leaned and the storm gnawed at the base of walls. The driver looked at Noor with quick understanding, the kind that does not ask names. They drove through streets turned sepia by dust, past shops closing early and mosques bright with unscheduled prayers. They did not speak of where, they spoke of how. "I will not pull you into a life that leaves you asking permission to breathe," he said. "Then build a life that breathes," she answered. They stopped 2 streets from Noor's building, where the storm thinned enough to see the geometry of laundry lines and balconies again. She reached for the handle and froze. The child would wake to wind and absence if they miscounted minutes. The fear was clean and absolute. It had no more rhetoric left in it. Khalid stepped out first. "We go together," he said. They climbed the stairs, the bulb humming as if nervous. At the door, Noor paused to listen. A small sound, a dream turning, then quiet. Inside, Leila slept with the camel's ear in her fist, the comfort of a world temporarily unchanged. Noor closed the window against the storm and turned to find Khalid not touching anything, as if his presence could bruise a room made of careful economies. And as the storm pressed against the glass, one truth lingered between them. The night had changed everything. But when the winds die and the sun returns, will they still be standing together, or on opposite sides of the palace gates? "Tell me, if you were in Noor's place, would you stay or walk away?" He looked at the table. The contract lay open, figures blinking up like lures. He picked it up, folded it, and set it beneath the leg of a chair that had always wobbled. The chair steadied. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Permission to breathe," he said. "Granted," she answered. Morning did not so much dawn as gather. The storm retreated the way shame does, reluctant, leaving a film on everything. The palace woke to statements drafted by people who knew how to launder truth. The ministry woke to requests for meetings that carried undertones of confession. The council woke to the math of risk and reform. Mariam did not sleep. She sat at the window until the horizon stopped being one color and made 2. And for the first time in years, the shape of her power looked to her like a room with fewer doors than she remembered. She reached for her phone and called no one. Then she stood and dressed and went to the garden where falcons are trained. She did not put on the glove. Weeks took on a careful rhythm. The palace held its breath and released it in measured public gestures. Cooperation, review, best practices, phrases that cover blood like gauze. The ministry opened a quiet inquiry that was not quiet for long. One by one, women appeared in rooms with microphones and spoke in the tone used by those who are done asking for permission to exist. Money moved in the direction money always moves when guilt needs to look like responsibility. The council changed 2 seats. The emir aged by a year and a half in a month and did not complain because complaint is a luxury. In a neighborhood with narrow streets that remember names, a different math took root. Khalid resigned 3 boards and accepted work that could be done without a crest on the letterhead. It paid enough if they did not pretend they needed more than they did. Noor found hours at a small dance studio, 3 bus stops away, and then, after the owner's nephew married and left for Doha, she found keys in her own hand. The room was a garage a month ago. Now it was a studio with walls painted the color of calm and a mirror salvaged from a hotel remodel. The floor was not sprung. They took turns remembering their knees. On the first day, she wrote a sign in careful letters. "Classes begin when the music does." Leila adapted faster than adults do when the weather changes. She learned to check the stove knob, to jiggle the front door twice, to hang her backpack on the same chair every day. She learned the new route to school and the new story about her father, which was the old story made honest. He was gone, and then he came back because the wind changed, and because truth did not like the house it had been living in. Sometimes she fell asleep on the studio floor while Noor swept the corners, and sometimes she counted time by 8 and made no mistakes. She asked questions only children are allowed to ask without apology. She asked one night at the kitchen table where 3 plates fit if they loved each other. "Will who come?" Khalid said, though he already knew. "Your mother." Noor's breath paused, then continued. "Enough," Noor said. When the doorbell rang 2 weeks later, they were not ready. People rarely are ready to test their own forgiveness. Mariam stood in the hallway, in an abaya without embroidery, and a face with less steel in it. She had lost weight without losing presence. Her hands were empty in a way that meant she had chosen them to be. Noor did not step aside at once. Khalid stood just behind her, not a shield, only a witness. Leila leaned around Noor's hip and looked up. She asked, "Because sometimes children are permitted metaphor." Mariam swallowed once. "I have been," she said. Noor let the sentence sit between them until it decided whether it belonged. Then she stepped back and pointed at a chair that had once wobbled. "We have tea," she said. The first visits were supervised by common sense. Once a month, 1 hour here, with Leila's rules posted on the refrigerator in orange marker. Be kind. No shouting. No making the air thin. Mariam read them aloud the first time and did not smile, because the rules were church enough. She brought no gifts for 2 months, and then brought flowers with short stems, because tall vases can hide behind pretension. Leila watched her like a scientist watches weather, and adjusted her hypothesis slowly. "She still looks like doors," she told Noor after the 3rd visit. Time, being itself, did most of the work. It scoured the worst edges, let ordinary things accumulate. Receipts from the corner shop, pencil shavings near the studio mirror, the scuff where a chair always misses the table leg by an inch. The inquiry ended without spectacle, and with enough truth to move money toward people it had hurt. The word reform did not change the shape of every room. It did open 2 windows. Mariam stayed away from microphones and folded her influence until it took up less space. She learned to sit in a kitchen where the fridge hums and a child asks for more cinnamon. On a night that smelled faintly of rain, though no rain fell, parents crowded the small studio for a recital named, with typical honesty, "Something We Can Do Together." Strings of paper lanterns made the ceiling look taller. The floor creaked once in the back left, as it always did, and everyone pretended not to hear it because love pretends when it needs to. Noor stood behind the curtain they had sewn from old saris and smoothed Leila's hair. Leila nodded, solemn, like a captain accepting weather. In the audience, Mariam sat beside Aunt Hannah and did not organize the air. When the music began, Leila stepped forward and led her small company with a confidence that had holes in it and was therefore real. She missed one beat, found the next, and smiled not at perfection, but at recovery. The applause was the kind that keeps rooms standing. After, flowers, not many, and none expensive, which is how beauty walks when it knows where it's going. Mariam held out a simple bouquet and waited. "For the best dancer I have seen who knows how to begin again," she said. Leila looked at Noor, who nodded. The hug that followed was quick and true and supervised by common sense. Aunt Hannah wiped at her eyes with the same hand that had fixed 15 zippers and 17 hearts. They cleaned together, as if closing a shop they loved was the last dance of the night. Chairs stacked, the mirror wiped, the sign straightened. On the walk home, the city smelled like evening bread, and the way palms know how to hold still. In the kitchen, Leila did her last sums for the day and drew a picture in thick crayons. 4 figures holding hands, one a little to the side. Underneath, in letters that leaned into one another, she wrote, "My family, Grandma learning to be part." Noor taped it to the fridge with more care than most papers receive. Later, when Leila slept, and the apartment held only the 3 quiets, clock, fridge, breath, Khalid put on a record that had nothing to do with waltzes and everything to do with now. He held out his hand the way he had the first time, but this time there were no eyes to buy the moment and sell it. There was only a room that knew their footsteps and a window that let the moon borrow the sill. He asked, because people who have learned how quickly weather can lie need the foolishness of vows. "Always," she said, and they moved through the small space like a promise finds its path, testing, adjusting, refusing to stop because a corner is sharp. From the doorway, Leila watched and did not interrupt. Children who have survived storms understand that sometimes the best way to hold a house together is to let the quiet happen. She smiled, small and secret, and went back to bed with the knowledge that her family did not look like the stories in books. It looked like something better, true. The moon, thin, exact, hung above a city that had learned for a while to breathe at the same time. The palace sat in its careful light. The studio slept in the dark with chalk dust floating like constellations you can make yourself if no one tells you which stars count. The wind rested. In the morning there would be new negotiations, new envelopes, new temptations to call control love. But tonight, someone had chosen a smaller room and a larger truth, and the air there was good. Did this ending move you? Tell me, if you were in Sheikha Mariam's place, what would you have done when the storm met the glass?